And thanks to you at home for staying with us for the next hour. There are two reasons why Osama bin Laden became the sort of terrorist kingpin that he ultimately became. The first reason is money. Osama bin Laden was labeled by the United States as the world's top financier of terrorism before he was ever implicated in planning and directing terrorist attacks himself. Before his own al-Qaeda plots, bin Laden was thought to have been the money man behind high-profile attacks like the Khobar Towers bombing in Saudi Arabia in 1996 or the first World Trade Center bombing back in 1993. He was international terrorism's money guy. Here's how NBC News first reported on Osama bin Laden back in 1997. Watch this.
This guerrilla warrior operates like the CEO of a Fortune 500 company, funding and supporting violence against the West and its allies. Call it Terror Inc. Private jets, Swiss bank accounts. He gives orders via the internet. As good a capitalist as he is a terrorist.
He was not the terrorist per se. He's the guy in the background pulling the strings.
Again, that was NBC News 1997. So the first reason Osama bin Laden became the world's terrorist kingpin was money. The second reason he became the world's terrorist kingpin, also money. But in a different way. Osama bin Laden's father, who was a construction mogul in Saudi Arabia, he died when bin Laden was about 10 years old. He left behind a hefty but undisclosed fortune. And that gave Osama bin Laden not only a lot of his own money to do what he wanted with, but it also gave him access to the mega-rich Saudi elite. He grew up playing with Saudi princes and sheiks. He reportedly had his own stable of horses by the time he was 15 years old. And that became the key not only to his direct financial power, but to his mystique, to what made him inspirational in the extremist world, to the myth of him. Bin Laden used to brag that when the Russians invaded Afghanistan, the Saudi government wanted to send a prince. The Saudi government wanted to send somebody from the royal family. But when they couldn't get an actual Saudi royal to go to Afghanistan to be an inspirational figure supporting the Muslim fighters against the communists there, they picked the next best thing. They picked Osama bin Laden, who was essentially Saudi royalty, even if he wasn't actually from the royal family. Those were the roots of his inspirational power as a terrorist figurehead. This rich guy, this almost unimaginably rich guy with unimaginably rich friends could be doing anything. Could be doing anything with all of his money and all of his influence, but he went and lived among the humble mujahideen fighters in Afghanistan, fighting against the communists. He funded that insurgency. He raised funds for that insurgency among his rich friends. He maybe even fought a little bit himself, although nobody really knows. But the insurgency ultimately wins. The Soviets go home. The Soviet Union collapses shortly thereafter. And this ostentatiously pious, humble by choice, rich kid gets to be the folk hero. When we think about Osama bin Laden, we think about mayhem and war and perverted pseudo-theology. But when bin Laden talked about what he was doing and why, he was always talking about money. Even at times you really would not expect him to be so money-focused, he talked a lot about money. Money was always how he explained what he was doing and what he and al-Qaeda were trying to accomplish. 1 month after the September 11th attacks, in October 2001, Osama bin Laden gave an interview to Al Jazeera. In that interview, he explained the effect of the 9/11 attacks as follows. Quote, "The losses on Wall Street amounted to 16%, and they said that this was a record loss that had never happened since the market opened more than 230 years ago. Such a huge collapse had never happened before. The capital in circulation in this market amounts to $4 trillion. If we multiply 16% by $4 trillion to find out the losses that their shares suffered, we find that it is $640 billion. This is what they lost in 1 hour. The daily gross national income in the United States is $20 billion. On the first week after the attacks, they did not work at all because of the psychological shock. Even to this very day, some people do not go to work because of the enormous shock." And he goes on and on and on and on about money. The bin Laden in this interview, this is a month after 9/11, he goes into great detail about layoffs in the airline industry, layoffs in the hotel industry, name-checking specific hotel chains. Ultimately, he adds it all up and says, by his sketchy terrorist math, that he thought that his great victory of the 9/11 attacks was that they cost the United States more than $1 trillion. That's what he saw the victory as. That's how he was talking in the first month after the 9/11 attacks. After that, even though bin Laden loomed very large in everything that Americans were thinking about, he didn't actually release many other video recordings. So there was that one right after 9/11, a month afterwards. There was a number of audio messages that he put out over the next few years. But it really wasn't until 2004, right before the George W. Bush-John Kerry presidential election, that bin Laden rather dramatically released another long videotaped statement. And again, what did he talk about in that statement? He talked about money. Reflecting again on the 9/11 attacks, bin Laden said, quote, "Al-Qaeda spent $500,000 on the event, while America in the incident and its aftermath lost, according to the lowest estimates, more than $500 billion. At this point, it is more than 3 years after 9/11, and he is still tallying up and bragging about the financial cost of the attack on the United States. The financial cost is what's in the front of his mind. When Americans think about the 9/11 attacks, do we think, yeah, those sure were expensive? That is not really the way that we tallied up the cost, but that is the way that he tallied it up. And that is the way he consistently explained al-Qaeda's overall strategy. Something that looked to us like nihilism, like insane Neanderthal fundamentalist bloodthirsty nihilism. From his perspective, from the perspective of the founder of al-Qaeda, it was economic, and it was economically rational. Bin Laden saying in 2004, quote, "We are continuing this policy in bleeding America to the point of bankruptcy. As for the economic deficit, it has reached astronomical numbers, estimated to total more than $1 trillion. The real loser is you, the American people, and their economy." According to bin Laden, the goal of al-Qaeda was to bleed America to the point of bankruptcy. That was his grand strategy. Our good friend Ezra Klein at the Washington Post wrote about this today, saying, quote, "For bin Laden, success was not to be measured in body counts. It was to be measured in deficits, in borrowing costs, in investments we weren't able to make in our country's continued economic strength." A month ago, a month before Osama bin Laden was killed, the Congressional Research Service published a report with what seemed to me to be the most conservative possible accounting for the cost of Iraq, Afghanistan, and other global war on terror operations since 9/11. By their very conservative estimate, just things like veterans' health care and the wars themselves directly cost about $1.3 trillion since 9/11, and $1.4 trillion if the president's budget for next year is approved. I say that's conservative. Those numbers are conservative because Nobel Prize-winning economist Joseph Stiglitz just wrote a book about just the Iraq war that was titled The $3 Trillion War. Again, just for Iraq, not even talking about Afghanistan, and not even talking about everything else we have spent so much on as a country because 9/11 happened, because of what al-Qaeda did, money that we would not have necessarily spent otherwise. Last year, the Washington Post published a remarkable investigation called Top Secret America, chronicling how much money we have poured into defense and intelligence and security over the last decade. I've gone back to this series again and again since they first published it. Quote, "The Pentagon's Defense Intelligence Agency has gone from 7,500 employees in 2002 to 16,500 today. The budget of the National Security Agency, which conducts electronic eavesdropping, doubled. 35 FBI Joint Terrorism Task Forces, 35 became 106. On the grounds of the former St. Elizabeth's Mental Hospital in Anacostia, a $3.4 billion Department of Homeland Security headquarters building will rise from the crumbling brick wards, the largest government complex built since the Pentagon. 24 government organizations were created by the end of 2001. In 2002, 37 more were created to track weapons of mass destruction, collect threat tips, and coordinate the new focus on counterterrorism. That was followed the next year by 36 new organizations, and 26 after that, and 31 more, and 32 more, and 20 or more each in 2007, 2008, and 2009. When 9/11 happened, the U.S. national debt was this. The day that Osama bin Laden was finally killed, nearly 10 years later, this was the debt. Reflecting hugely, of course, the Great Recession caused by the financial sector self-immolating. But consider also that the already historically massive U.S. defense budget doubled since 2001. The U.S. intelligence budget, who knows? We didn't have something called the Department of Homeland Security budget when 9/11 happened. Now we do. It got $42 billion last year. The investment in innovation and energy and human capital and sacrifice that America has put into security over the past 10 years is really mind-bending. It really reflects a massive national effort. And maybe there's waste and fraud and abuse, and maybe a lot of that money has gone down a rat hole or a spider hole. But even if you do not take that tack on it, even if it hasn't. Let's say you're being totally uncritical about the character of that spending. If you're just trying to be honest about how much of it there has been, what is the effect of that type of massive reorganization of American priorities? What is the effect of that on the strength of our country, on the economic strength of our country? In 1999, before 9/11, this was median household income in America. Here's what happened in the years since 9/11. Median household income has dropped by 5%. As that average income has sunk over the past decade, the basic cost of living has gone off the charts. Here's what happened to healthcare costs, for example, over the last decade. The average annual premiums for a family in 2000, just over $6,000. In 2010, that figure rose to more than $13,000. How about something like home heating oil? Basics, right? February 2000, a gallon of home heating oil was $1.35. Now that'll be $3.88 a gallon, please. As incomes in this country have stayed flat, and as the basic costs of living have gone up, making the median American family materially more poor, we've also seen things like our education results decline. In 2000, the U.S. ranked 14th in science and 18th in math. By 2009, the U.S. was down to 17th in science and 25th in math. The result of all of this? Lower wages, higher living costs, poorer education. The result is the middle class in this country disintegrating. Income inequality is worse now than it has been in decades. The U.S. leading the way in economic inequality in the whole developed world. Now, as a measure of America's strength, the modern impossibility of the middle class is not something to feel romantic or wistful or, again, even ideological about, not at a time like this. But it is worth thinking about whether or not America has a strong, resilient economy. Rich people being really rich, that alone does not give you a strong economy or a strong nation. That can just be feudalism with cable. One of the great granular legacies of the last 10 years of American priorities is that 4 of the 5 wealthiest counties in the country are now in the Washington, D.C. Beltway. Think about that. The Forbes list of these counties says things like Fairfax County, Virginia is home to companies with strong connections to intelligence agencies like the CIA and the National Counterterrorism Center. Yeah, all that spending does buy you something. Buys you something here at home, in addition to buying you something abroad. Osama Bin Laden's stated goal for the 9/11 attacks was to cause us to spend ourselves into oblivion. His goal was to do something cheap and radical and traumatizing that would cause us to react in a way that bankrupted us, so that what they couldn't take down by force or by ideological competition, we would take down ourselves by panic. Osama Bin Laden, I'm happy to say, is now dead. And now we have a choice to make about whether the next decade of spending and policy and priorities will be one that makes us stronger, whether it'll be one that gets us back to competing on our own terms for our own goals. Joining us now is Eugene Robinson, MSNBC political analyst and Pulitzer Prize-winning columnist for The Washington Post. Gene, thank you so much for being here.